Eddie and I have been doing this a long time. And, in fact, we've been doing this longer than churches have been using video. So, what's interesting is just to watch, we did live shows. We tried our hand at how can we put this on video, and then what are we going to do? And then, around 2000, maybe 2005, six, somewhere around there, we connected with a guy. He was the media pastor at my church at the time, who figured out how to take what we do live and put it on film. And we just started putting it out there. I think it's a beautiful picture. Eddie and I say, I learned it from him, but it's, do what you can where you are with what you have and leave the results up to God. And so we started just putting it out there. And churches just started going, we want more of this. I mean, at the end of the day, a pastor is always looking for what's the most creative way that I can share the message. In particular, when it comes to holidays, you can only tell the story of Christmas so many times before you need to come up with how do I tell it in a more creative way. Same with Easter, same with Mother's Day, Father's Day, all of the holidays. And so what's happened is a lot of our videos that we make, we really try to focus on those big holidays, those big events, and we're just watching pastors continue to use them. And then with social media, families find them and use them to encourage each other. So it's just grown and grown and grown.
You have all sorts of content that is available not only for Easter, but also for the season leading up to Easter, the Lent season. You have a new series. It's called The Road to Easter. An Easter series. As I understand it, it actually consists of 5 different videos. What's the concept here?
Yeah, they are basically, it's Tommy and myself walking through Palm Sunday. You've got Good Friday. You got Easter Sunday. You've got all these different pieces of, when we look at the Easter progression through Scripture, we hit those big points, the big pillars of Easter. And it's Tommy and myself at different locations talking about that moment in time when we see Jesus, on the donkey, when we see Jesus, being crucified on the cross, being, what did it look like in the upper room? So we try to set the table for a church, for a growth group, for a pastor, for a youth minister, to have something in their tool bag, so to speak, to create a visual, and then they come up and they land it with the message. We also give sermon helps. We try to give them everything they could need when it comes to Easter, those weekends leading up to Easter. So we're very proud of it. Yeah, we feel very good about it.
So, Tommy, take me inside those planning meetings, the two of you, and perhaps I don't know how many team members are involved in creating all this content. What are some of the things you really God laid on, or if I can say it like this, what God laid on your heart with respect to what you wanted to communicate here?
This particular series, we were actually taking a trip to the Holy Land, and we were planning on filming everything in the Holy Land. And literally a week, maybe less than a week, before we were supposed to fly there, was when the attacks happened. And so we had everything ready to go, scripts written, plan to go, everything. And we had to change things immediately. And so then we had to take what had been written to literally be, in the Garden of Gethsemane, literally at Golgotha, like that's where all these things were going to be filmed, and go, okay, what are we going to do now? And the great thing is, Eddie is the creative side out of the two of us. He's the writer. He's the guy who comes up with ideas, and he works with our lead writer, Renee Gutteridge, who's just a real blessing and comes up with these ideas. And so then, we had to take all those back and go, okay, if we're not filming in the Holy Land, what do we do now? And so somebody in our team had a great idea. Let's go to Northern California, where you have the giant redwoods and where you have an amazing view of the ocean and where you have deserts and all these different looks, and go, okay, we'll tweak these somehow to make them work in that location. And as it always is, when your plans don't work out, God has a better plan. And boy, he just helped us create something that I think is visually stunning and is going to bless the church.
Eddie and Tommy, the Skit guys, here on the Intersection podcast. You can learn more by going to the website skitguys.com. Well, finally, on this edition of the Intersection podcast, his ministry is called Dad Tired. I had the opportunity to talk to the founder of that ministry, who also hosts a podcast. His name is Jerrad Lopes. He is the author of a book called Dad Tired and Loving It, Stumbling Your Way to Spiritual Leadership. He has also authored a children's book called My Daddy's Hero. In our recent Meeting House conversation, he provided words of encouragement for fathers who desire to serve God and their families. From that conversation, this is Jerrad Lopes now.
One thing that we say is, that there's kind of a tagline attached to the title, Dad Tired. The tagline would be, and loving it. So yes, we're exhausted. We are men who are working jobs as hard as we can to provide for our families. And then we know that when we get back into the driveway of our house, that we are clocking into our real jobs, the jobs that will have an impact for eternity. And so that's what I mean by Dad Tired. We're not trying to be men who just clock out of our normal 40 or 60-hour work weeks or whatever we're doing and come home and sit in front of a TV and kind of check out mentally. We know that we are going to now engage in the roles that God has called us into, which is husband, father, and disciple. And now we're pouring our hearts out in that area, it's just exhausting. But again, like I said at the beginning, our souls should not be weary. If we're connected to the source of life, we are exhausted because we are pouring our lives out for the people around us. Mainly our families and our children, our wives and our kids, but our souls are not weary because we're getting our source, our energy, our life from God himself.
So out of that period of darkness that you were sharing with us about earlier, how is it that you saw God really bring you out and bring restoration into your life and your relationship with him?
Well, I think that a lot of guys probably wouldn't admit this. This isn't a word that a lot of men use, but I think there are actually a lot of men in our country and even in our world. I actually just got home from being out of the country yesterday. And I think there's a lot of men in the world who are actually lonely. And that's not a word that most men use. Lonely isn't kind of in our vocabulary very often. But for me, I was lonely. I didn't have close friends. I didn't have men that I was confessing sin to and repenting and being honest with, men who knew all of who I was and still loved me. And I think more men need that. And when they have that, when they have true, deep, gospel-centered friendships, they can then experience that feeling of what it's like to be fully known, fully loved, confess sin so that they might be healed, confess sin to God so that they can be forgiven. And then when they walk back into their families, these are men who are now confident and healed and filled up by the Spirit of God to be the men that God's called them to be in their homes.
So as you began to develop this ministry, as God really showed you himself and how he desired to use you to minister to fathers, what are some of the guiding principles that you saw that he was really showing you in order to reach out to fathers in the way that you do?
Yeah, I think it would go back to what I just said. I think a lot of men are lonely. I think a lot of men are they're paralyzed by either their shame or their ignorance. So one, they don't have a dad. They didn't have a dad or a man around in their life to teach them what it looks like to be the spiritual leader of their home, and or they maybe did have a man in their life, but they've personally just dealt with their own sin and shame, and that's kind of paralyzed them to think, how in the world am I going to lead my family towards a God that I don't even know where I'm sitting in my own relationship with God? And so what we try to do is we just point guys back to the gospel. Like we talk about parenting, but we're really not a parenting strategy ministry. We're not even really a marriage strategy. We're just a gospel-centered ministry. We really believe that if guys could rest in the truth that they are known and loved by the God of the universe, and really have a deep understanding of that when they confess sin and they repent and they turn back to Jesus, that they are loved and delighted in by the God of the universe, that truth is motivating enough to equip them to be the husbands and fathers and disciples that God is calling them to be.
Jerrad Lopes here on The Intersection. You can learn more by going to the website dadtired.com. Well, we are nearing the end of this week's edition of the Intersection Podcast, a weekly production of the Meeting House. You can learn more through meetinghouseonline.info or by linking to the Meeting House homepage through the programming menu at faithradio.org. Through the Meeting House homepage, as well as that programming menu, you'll find a link to the Media Center, the place you can go to listen to or download full conversations with recent guests featured on the Intersection podcast and the Meeting House radio program. You can also find links to the podcast, to the Media Center, as well as its Apple Podcast feed, and you can watch video of Meeting House guests through the Faith Radio YouTube channel. You can find a link from the Meeting House homepage. 2 blogs are accessible. One is The Front Room with devotional thoughts and commentary from the Meeting House. There's also The 3 with 3 stories of relevance to the Christian community. And you can follow me on X or Twitter and access the Meeting House Facebook page. Again, that website address is meetinghouseonline.info. Thanks for joining me for this week's edition of the Intersection Podcast. I'm Bob Crittenden.